Thanks everybody for coming out. My name is Andy Z. I'm the spokesperson for Revolution Books tonight. Actually, I'm not just the spokesperson for the store tonight. I'm always the spokesperson for the store. It's nothing particular to this evening. We're really pleased to have Miko Peled here tonight, and his book just published by Just World Books, The General Son, A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So what we're going to have is, as Miko's going to talk, I'm just going to welcome you and tell you a few things about the store. And then the store manager, Clark Kissinger, is going to introduce Miko. Afterwards, we're going to hear from the publisher of Just World Books. And then I'm going to tell you a few things about Revolution Books. And fair warning, ask you for your support for Revolution Books. And then we're going to have a Q&A with Miko. And afterwards, he will sign books. And we'll do that up front. I would say if you want to have a picture with Miko, take the picture then, because I'm going to ask you all to turn off your cell phones and inform you that there's no audio or video recording of the program. However, the program will be available online in a matter of days and on Revolution Books website, and I believe also on the Just World Books website or a site that they send this to. So it should be available very, very soon. So if this is your first time here, welcome to Revolution Books. This is a bookstore, and it's a bookstore at the center of building a movement for revolution. And it's very kind of exciting that we're having this program this week, and because just as I mentioned, discussing the pastries that are available up front that were donated for a program we did just last Monday night in conjunction with the New York Theater Workshop on the current play that's currently playing there. It's called Food and Fadwa. Fadwa is a Palestinian woman who is preparing a meal for her daughter's, her younger sister's wedding, and the entire family shows up, and one can only imagine what it's like to have your whole family show up, and then a calamity strikes. There's a curfew by the Israeli occupation, and then the domestic drama sets in with that as a backdrop. So last week we had a fundraising dinner that dealt with life in Belin, in the Palestinian section of Palestine. And, Revolution Books has done a number of events on Israel. When the bombs began falling on Gaza, it was only going on 3 days when we said we must do a forum. Where should we do it? Well, here's the store, seats about 80 to 100 people. Let's do it on the Upper West Side. Where better to talk about this great crime being committed? And we did it at Ethical Culture, and over 400 people came out right as the bombs were still falling. And then after Hamavi Marmara was bombed, I guess it's now 2 years, we did an emergency forum here, and the place was filled out to the back, and lots of people came out. And we've had a number of forums on Israel and Palestine because it's consistent with the basic stand of this bookstore, which is one, you could say, it's internationalism. The whole world comes first. We're about exposing people to the books and the engagement with different ideas, but about changing the entire world and all the social relations and economics of the current world. I'll tell you more about that later. But so from that perspective, this fault line question, this fault line issue of Israel is very important, and the rights of the Palestinian people to be free. So we will get into that more, and Miko is going to tell you his story. And what I want to do now is introduce Clark to introduce Miko. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Here at Revolution Books, of course, we believe that most people's experience comes from indirect sources. You read about it, you see a picture, you go to a movie, something like that. We don't all experience things directly, personally ourselves. But sometimes there are individuals who come forward who actually have had incredible personal experience that they share with us that enables us to understand our world and what needs to be done in it ever more. Miko Peled is such a person. There are very few people in this world who, on the one hand, is someone who was born in Israel, in Jerusalem, had a grandfather who was a signer of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, had a father who was a top commanding general in the '67 war, and at the same time has gone among the Palestinian people today to experience the situation in which they live, to make bridges and to build friends. He's a peace activist and is someone who has written this important book for us that he's going to talk about this evening. To repeat what Andy said, I do hope you will buy the book while you're here this evening, and Miko will be present to sign it for you up here at the end of the program. So without further ado, let me turn the program over to Miko Peled.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. It's a pleasure. Helena, my publisher, is here, so nice to see you. And Pam Olson is over here, who wrote an excellent book on the subject as well. So I hope you get her book as well. And before I give my talks, I learned that it's good to begin with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that if anybody came here hoping to hear a balanced presentation, then you can ask for your money back and leave, because this is not a balanced presentation. You know, the issue of Israel-Palestine is it's a raw nerve. Everybody, whether they're Israelis, Palestinians, or none of the above, have strong feelings about this, strong opinions about this. It invokes a lot of passion. And I don't think a balanced presentation actually is possible on this issue. I think if anybody thinks they are balanced or their opinion is balanced, they're either lying to themselves or lying to their audience. So mine is not a balanced presentation, and you know what? This is really not a balanced issue. A lot of times people compare this to children, fighting in the playground, and the grown-ups need to stay away because the kids need to work it out, or two people who just can't get along and they need to sort this out themselves. I think a more accurate description would be, if we're going back to the schoolyard analogy, would be a bully with a loaded gun in the playground, and now something's got to be done. And of course, that is not balanced. I gave this talk, or not this talk, but I gave a talk to a class of 8th graders about 6 weeks ago in San Diego. And they've been studying the issue. And one of the things that the class did on their own is they took a little poll to see how many of them believed that peace was possible in their lifetime. Now, 8th graders, they're 13 years old, 14 years old. I'll tell you, I won't tell you now what the results were. I'll tell you later, perhaps. But I think it was fascinating, and I was thinking, well, maybe I'll ask you guys, raise your hand if you think peace is possible in your lifetime, in Israel-Palestine. The question is, do you think that peace in Israel-Palestine is possible in your lifetime? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, raise your hand if you don't. Absolutely don't. Wow. Okay, well, the kids thought, at the beginning of my comments, the kids thought that it was not possible in their lifetime. But I think a lot of it has to do with the information they were given. And I think a lot of us are like that, too. I think you'll see from my remarks, and one of the reasons I actually do this, I talk about this, and I wrote the book, is because I have no doubt at all that peace is possible in our lifetime. But it was kind of sad to see these 8th graders feel that way. And I had an interesting discussion just a couple of nights ago with a Jewish couple, kind of a mainstream Jewish couple in San Diego. He's a doctor and his wife, and we went out to dinner, and they read my book. And of course, being a mainstream Jewish couple, they love Israel, they've been to Israel, they're very Zionist. And a very interesting conversation ensued. And one of the things that I kind of noticed as we were talking is the double standard in which Zionism exists. It's really a combination of myth and lies and double standard. And it's interesting how here in this country it's been accepted. People don't see the hypocrisy of accepting Zionism while rejecting the Palestinian narrative. And it's interesting how mainstream it's become and how obvious and how okay everybody is with this. What is Zionism? Zionism is a quest of a people to return to their homeland, right? But of course, not the people that were exiled from their homeland and not their direct descendants, because they all died 2,000 years ago. We're talking about people who have some kind of a claim to Jewish ancestry. So their right to return to their homeland after thousands of years of exile. And nobody sees a problem with that. It seems quite acceptable. I mean, Zionism has become quite an acceptable idea. But Palestinians, the Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes and thrown out of their land and exiled from their country, many of them are still alive. That only happened 65, 70 years ago. Certainly their direct descendants are still alive. But when you bring up the right of return of Palestinians to their homes, then, that's impossible. That's dangerous. That's not something that we're willing to accept. But it's interesting. I mean, the precedent of return being a good idea is something that the Zionists, that the Israelis, that the Jews have, there's already a precedent that was created. So why is it not okay for Palestinians to return to their home? And of course, one of the concerns that's voiced is the concern of what they call a demographic threat. Because if there are too many Arabs in Israel, then that would be a threat. That would be a bad thing. It's very dangerous to have a lot of Arabs around. But it's interesting that when the Jews were immigrating, or when Jews still are immigrating, nobody thought that this would present a demographic threat to the Arab population of Palestine. This was never a concern. One of the things I have my oldest son is 18. He just graduated from high school, and he loves politics. And so he and I like to watch West Wing together. And what's interesting about that series, there's a lot of interesting things about that series, but what's interesting is how Israel is portrayed in a very realistic way in terms of how Israel comes up when discussions are, in the discussions of foreign policy in the Middle East and everything, and how prominent Israel is, and how natural the support for Israel and the Israeli point of view, and how natural it is to completely discount the Arab and the Palestinian point of view and completely take for granted that we all agree that there's some kind of consensus that the Israeli and the Zionist point of view are fully accepted and are okay. And in one particular episode, they're talking about the refugees and the issue of the refugees. And one comment that's made by one of the, somebody in the administration is, well, they need to get over it. They need to get over it. Yeah, they want to return, but you know what? Get over it. And of course, this is a lot of times the view that's expressed, or the sentiment that's expressed by Israelis and by people who support Zionism. The past is behind us. They need to get over it. They need to forget. But of course, they won't forget. Palestinians refuse to forget what happened to them in 1948 and ever since. And it's interesting that coming from Jewish people, particularly, we still remember and we still hold a grudge against the Egyptians because what the Pharaoh did to us 5,000 years ago. And in fact, every single year during Passover, what do? We are commanded to remember and recite what happened to us. Now, this is 5,000 years ago. We're talking about the Pharaoh. And we still talk about the Greeks, and we still talk about the Romans and what they did to us, and the Maccabees, as though, we lived this. Hanukkah, we were all Maccabees. But the Palestinians have to forget. The Palestinians have no right to remember. And of course, in Israel today, commemorating the Nakba, commemorating the catastrophe of the Palestinians is almost illegal. It's not completely illegal, but it's almost illegal. Now, of course, standing here today, it's easy for me to talk like this. I didn't always see things this way. And it was relatively late in life when I was actually became aware that there's another narrative, that there's a Palestinian narrative. And what's interesting is I was born and raised in Jerusalem, which is supposedly a mixed city. And I talk about, my growing up and so forth in the General Sun in the book. And I accepted this just like everybody else does. The Israeli, the Zionist narrative. And even though, like I said, I grew up in Jerusalem, which is supposedly a mixed city, I never met Palestinians. Because even though Jerusalem is kind of united and mixed, it's very segregated. As is the rest of Israel, as is the rest of the whole country. The communities could be very close to one another, but they're completely segregated. So there is no contact. So the first time I actually sat with Palestinians in a room, like normal people, discussing the issues and hearing about what their perspective was, I was living in the United States. I was almost 40 years old. And that was the very first time I had that opportunity. And it was not an easy process. So when I speak in front of Jewish audiences, I know how difficult it is to hear that Israel is not this wonderful creation, that Israel is not this wonderful democracy, that all these wonderful things that we know and love about Israel are actually myths. I know how hard it is. It's almost like having your teeth pulled out without anesthesia. It's a very, very painful process, especially if you were raised a Zionist, if you were raised to love Israel. And I went through this process. I had a really good support group, which was was called the San Diego Jewish-Palestinian Dialogue Group. And we would meet periodically in people's homes, and everybody would relate their narrative, their own personal story. And that was the beginning of my journey. The title is The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. My journey into Palestine began in San Diego. It was the year 2000. And what became clear to me was that, first of all, the occupation did not begin in 1967, but began in 1948. But the occupied territories are not the West Bank and Gaza, but the entire state of Israel is occupied Palestine. And that really seriously gives you an entirely different perspective. And that the War of Independence, the War of 1948, which is really the War of 1948 is a large part of what it means to be an Israeli. Because once again, we were attacked. Once again, we prevailed. Once again, we were the few versus the many. And this narrative of the Maccabees and David and Goliath has repeated itself once again. So it makes perfect sense. And to realize that this was not so was very painful, especially since my father was an officer. He was part of the Jewish militia, the Zionist militia, at the time, the Haganah and the Palmach. So suddenly to realize that this wasn't the way it really was a very painful process. And so it wasn't that we were attacked and then we won the war because we were deserving and we were smart and we were, again, like the Maccabees and so on. The reality was that we were not attacked. The reality was that the state that we live in was built on the ashes of another country, that there were massacres involved, that there was mass expulsions that were involved, and basically the country was looted and taken away from another nation. And that is how the state of Israel was created. And this is not a simple thing to come to terms with it. It's not a simple thing to hear. Or I should say the other way around. You hear it first, and then it takes a while to come to terms with it. And one of the stories I talk about in my book is about my mother, and I dedicated the book to my mother, largely because of this story. She's 85 years old now. She still lives in Jerusalem, and she was born and raised in Jerusalem. And she used to tell me, she used to recall being a child and on the weekends walking through the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, particularly the Arab neighborhoods of West Jerusalem. And those neighborhoods still exist, although, of course, the Palestinians are no longer there. The Arabs are no longer there. But these are beautiful homes with beautiful gardens in the back, and usually there's a lemon tree in the front and a balcony. And she used to remember seeing the families on the Saturday or the Sunday morning, sitting there together and so on. And then during the 1948 war, when these people were expelled from their homes, the homes, again, like I said, and they're still there in Jerusalem, they're beautiful homes, they're very distinct, were given to Israeli families. And she was living at the time with my two older siblings in a small apartment with my grandmother, which was not fun. And she was offered one of these wonderful homes. Her husband was an officer in the front. The homes were available, and she was offered one of these homes. And her reaction is something that I think is very, very important and contributed a lot to the way I see things today. But her reaction was that she couldn't possibly take the home of one of these families. She couldn't possibly take the home of a family that now lives in a refugee camp. And the way she would tell the story, the way she related to the story is that when the soldiers came in, and the families had left, the coffee was still warm on the table. And very often when I tell this story, when I give this talk, I'll have Palestinians come up to me and tell me that they have a home in one of these neighborhoods. Happens over and over again. The coffee was still warm on the table, and she would say, can you imagine how much these families, how much these mothers miss their home, how much they must miss their country? And then she would talk about the truckloads that she would see full of loot, and how embarrassed she felt for these Israelis who would do this. Come with trucks and steal everything for all the contents of the homes. And this is more than just a story of making the right choice or the moral choice. This is a story of actually placing the other on an equal footing as ourselves. I was asked this question a couple of weeks ago in a discussion. This is really the value of this story, is that they deserve what we deserve. We shouldn't do to them what we wouldn't want others to do to us, because we are equal. And in Israel, that's not how Israelis usually view Palestinians. Now, after the war was over, of course, the Palestinians who did remain within the newly created state within Israel were given this name of Israeli Arabs. Or actually, in Hebrew, it's not Israeli Arabs. In Hebrew, it's the Arabs of Israel. In other words, they have no identity other than the fact that they happen to be Arabs and they happen to be in Israel. Completely stripped away from their land, from their homes, from their country, and now from their identity. And as I was talking to this elderly Jewish couple the other day, and this comes up a lot, the claim is, well, but they do very well in Israel. In fact, they do so well that they don't want to leave. Given the choice, they don't want to leave. And what's absurd is that nobody sees the problem with this comment. First of all, they don't want to leave because this is their land. They were there before us. And they're not doing well. The Palestinian communities within Israel are neglected. They're poor. They have to live in an environment of such cultural racism, besides the fact that there's legalized racism and legalized discrimination against them within the state of Israel. But there's a culture of racism that they have to live in. And as Jewish communities, Israeli Jewish communities, were being built all around these Palestinian communities within Israel, you'd be hard-pressed to find a home, a school, a hospital, a road, a dime or a dollar that was invested in them in terms of infrastructure and so on in these communities. So there's this myth out there that somehow the Arabs in Israel are doing really, really well. They're far below, the poverty levels are far below the national average and so on and so forth. So this is yet another myth of how wonderful Israel is. Now, if we move forward again to 1967, the 45th anniversary of the Six-Day War was just a few days ago. I talk about being the general son. This is probably one of the most significant aspects of the story of what I relay in the book, and probably one of the stories that raises the most controversy or the most arguments. And once again, the story goes along with the narrative. What is the narrative? The Jews are always attacked by some evil empire, by some evil force, and the Jews are always the minority, yet they prevail. Now, we can't say God was on our side here because Israel is a secular state, but there's that sense that, we were right and we hold the moral high ground, and therefore we prevailed. And the story is that Israel was under an existential threat in the months and weeks leading up to, this became clear in the months and weeks leading up to June 1967. And the Israeli army attacked and had to attack, preemptive strike, and prevailed, again, thanks to our wit and our preparedness and, against all odds. But one of the things that I did in preparation for the book, being the general's son, I wanted to go and see what the general had to say in real time. My father was on the general staff of the IDF, of the Israeli army, during those days. And there are a lot of books that actually have been written about that period. It's that period leading up to the war, the May, mid-April, May of 1967, and the beginning of June, and that what happened. and how was it that the war took place. But still, I thought I want to go into the Israeli archives, into the army archives, and take a look at actually what was said in these meetings, in the IDF General Staff meetings. And there was one particular meeting that was interesting. It was on June the 2nd. It was when the cabinet, the Israeli cabinet, came into the army headquarters for a discussion, which is interesting. Why would the cabinet go to the army and not the other way around? We're talking about a civilian democracy. It tells you something about the balance of power in Israel. And during that meeting and in meetings before that, there was one line that I saw repeating itself, but I never saw in any other book. I never heard in any of the documentaries that I've seen, and I've seen a lot. And that is that the Egyptian army, which was the threat, supposedly, was not prepared for war. And if you recall, the Egyptian army had moved into the Sinai Peninsula, which was supposed to be demilitarized. And Nasser, President Nasser of Egypt, kicked out the UN peacekeeping forces and threatened to close the Straits of Tiran so Israeli shipping boats, Israeli boats would not be able to go up to Eilat. And the army saw this as an opportunity for war. And in those discussions, what was being said was the Egyptian army needs another 1.5 to 2 years in order to be prepared for war. Therefore, let's attack. We have an opportunity and we have a good cause to begin a war and destroy the Egyptian army. And the Israeli cabinet was hesitant. They weren't so keen on war. And there's an interesting relationship between these two groups. The Israeli cabinet are made of older Jews, mostly immigrants from Eastern Europe, kind of my grandfather's generation. The IDF General Staff, they were all in their early 40s. Most of them were born in the country, born in Palestine, Israel. They were all in the Haganah, and these were these tough, assertive, and they knew that they were ready. And when they saw that they were going to have to wait because the cabinet was hesitating, they said, well, the line is going to be that the threat remains, but of course the government has to decide what it has to decide. But they're really, really pushing for war, and again, and again, and again, and again, they were saying the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. They're advancing an army that is not prepared for war. And they just saw this as an opportunity. Finally, there was a lot of pressure that was placed on the cabinet, both by the army and by there was popular pressure as well. And the cabinet decided to approve a preemptive strike against Egypt, which again is an interesting thing. People don't like to talk about this. The Israeli cabinet approved a preemptive strike against Egypt. The Egyptian army was destroyed, and the Sinai Peninsula was taken in a matter of a couple of days. And then the generals who were not part of that battle, because they were in charge of the north or they were in charge of the central command, they wanted their piece of the war too. And they initiated the conquest of the West Bank and the conquest of the Golan Heights. Not with approval from the cabinet, but at their own initiative. The cabinet approval came afterwards. Since it was a success, of course, everybody said, oh yes, of course, it was a wonderful idea. But it was not legal. And that's another point that was being made that I talk about. And so then the Golan Heights was taken. And this is an area that Israel actually really wanted for a long time. And of course, the West Bank. Especially the Israeli military, felt that the fact that the West Bank was not taken in 1948 was a big mistake. And finally they were there, and they had Hebron, and they had Shiloh, and they had Shechem. They had all these wonderful biblical names back again in Israeli control, and of course the old city of Jerusalem back in Israeli control. And these young generals, for the first time in over 2,000 years, handed the Jewish people control of the land of Israel. I mean, how much greater can you be? Gods of the Olympus. And this is how they were viewed by the people. This is how they were viewed by the cabinet. This is, I think, how they viewed themselves too. Gods of the Olympus. Now they knew that this was not going to be a difficult battle, but still they delivered. And the interesting thing is that the entire thing took 6 days. If Israel was really being attacked by massive armies, could they do all this in 6 days? And in the process, kill over 15,000 Arab soldiers, as opposed to 700 Israeli casualties. 15,000 in 6 days, as opposed to 700 Israeli casualties. So again, when you look at the numbers and you look at the facts and you look at what actually took place, it's an entirely different story. So it's much easier to fall back on the myth and say, well, This has happened again. It happened in 48. We were attacked and we prevailed. It happened in 67. We attacked and we prevailed. The Maccabees, we were attacked and we prevailed. David and Goliath, we were attacked and we prevailed. This is all the same thing. But again, when you look at the stories bit by bit, and that's kind of what I did in the book, you see a completely different story. Now, 45 years later, what do we have in the West Bank? Israel invested billions upon billions of dollars in the West Bank, but only for one purpose, to bring Israeli Jews into the West Bank. Not a dime was invested for the Palestinians, who make up the majority of the population in the West Bank. And we're talking about, sometimes people have this impression that the settlements are these little, little villages or small towns, little outposts. We're talking about major cities, schools and highways and malls. We're talking about major, major investment. But not a dime for the population whose land this actually belongs to. So again, when you look at what Israeli politicians, cabinet members, generals, the way they viewed the result of the war, the way they viewed the conquest of the West Bank, and their enthusiasm of beginning the settlement projects in the West Bank, this whole notion that somehow, Israel was willing to negotiate, and Israel was willing to return the territories, and Israel is willing to do all these things, you can see it's a complete myth. If they're willing to do this, why did they invest so heavily? Why did they build all these cities and towns in the West Bank? Why did they kick out so many hundreds of thousands of people from within the West Bank and from Jerusalem? It just doesn't add up. And again, the same process that took place in the rest of Palestine, the rest of Israel after 48, where investments were made for Israeli Jews and Palestinians were completely disenfranchised. The same thing happened in the West Bank, of course, because this was the continuation of the same process. And so, when you look today, when you drive through the West Bank, what do you see? You see these settlements, the major ones, with swimming pools and green lawns and beautiful villas and so on and so forth. There's malls and everything, and meters away, really meters away, you see Palestinian communities that barely have water. And sometimes they say, well, yes, these communities are so remote that the water doesn't reach them, or they're so remote that the electricity doesn't reach them. But when you have a settlement next to it, it reaches them the next day. Somehow the water and the electricity have no problem, or the roads, paved roads, have no problem reaching these areas when there's an Israeli Jewish settlement there. They only have trouble reaching them when it's a Palestinian community. And the issue of water, of course, is a very important issue. It came to me, actually by chance. I was at the refugee camp, the Haitian refugee camp, with my son. And I have a picture of him in the Haitian in the book, and the look on his face of the shock at what he saw. What the refugee camp looks like. It's 13,000 people living on 1/4 square mile, 1 square quarter mile. And there's a beautiful community center there called Phoenix House. And the reason it's called Phoenix House is because they built it and the Israelis destroyed it. And they built it again, Israel destroyed it again. Went on and on and on, and it prevailed, and it's still there. So they call it Phoenix House. And it's a very nice facility. It's the only facility, really, serious facility that's available to the people in the camp. But there's no swimming pool. And I thought, why don't you have a swimming pool here? That'd be a great idea in a place like this. And they looked at me kind of like, you really don't get it, do you? There is no water. The Israeli authorities closed the water, and I have several friends who live there. And when I see them sometimes, they go for days without water. Why? They don't know. But they closed the water to the camp. 13,000 people for days without water. Not because there is no water available. It's because there's no water available to them. And of course, a large portion of the water that Israel takes, that Israel uses, comes from the West Bank. It's called the Mountain Aquifer. It's one of the largest sources of good water that exists there. And the way Israel controls the water is very interesting, because Israel has the water authority, and they control and allocate the water. So Israelis get something around 300 cubic meters of water per person per year. Palestinians get somewhere between 30 and 80 cubic meters of water per person per year. So why? Do they wash less? Do they drink less? Do their trees need less water? How does anybody justify this? And yet, the settlers in the West Bank are allocated 1,500 cubic meters of water per year. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And again, you have Palestinian communities, villages and towns that have no water. How would you feel? And yet they dare to resist. And then they dare to protest. And that they dare to, throw Qassam rockets or do whatever they do. How dare they? And we're so good to them. So this is a big part of the problem. And, of course, the issue of resistance and the issue of terrorism is an important one. I talk about this greatly in my book. My own personal experience with it was when my sister's daughter was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. She was 13 years old. It was September 1997. And she went into Jerusalem downtown with some friends to buy books. 2 young Palestinians blew themselves up. And she was right there. Now, how do you deal with that? As a family, it's very difficult. There's no words to express the horror and the tragedy of a 13-year-old girl, being killed like this. And because she was the granddaughter, my father had already passed away, but because she was his granddaughter, the granddaughter of a well-known general, and not only a general, but Mr. Peace. Mr. Peace of Palestinians, and now look what they did to him. This was the attitude. And my sister's apartment in Jerusalem was packed with mourners and people who came to pay respects, and journalists, a lot of journalists. And one of the things that my sister said after she was, after the funeral, she was asked all these questions. What about retaliation? What about revenge? And, what do you think should be done with these people? And her comment was very simple. First of all, she said, no real mother would want this to happen to another mother. Number one. Number two, I accuse my government, this Israeli government, and preceding governments, who have brought these Palestinians, who have brought these 2 young men to kill themselves and kill my daughter. The level of despair, the level of oppression that they had to be living through in order to do this. Who brought this upon them? Who brought this hatred upon them? But that's what happened when you oppress the entire population, when you deny them their rights, you deny them their water, you deny them their land, you kill their fathers, you arrest their brothers. What do we expect? And of course, the fact that she came out like that created even more of a stir, and there was more press and so on and so forth. But this was, she kind of led all of us with these statements. And she's an activist. Some of you may know her, Nurit, and she's come out with an excellent book recently, or just now, I should say, about how Israelis are taught about Palestinians, or racism in Israeli textbooks. It's an excellent book, and she's going to be here at the end, I think in October in New York. Now, I have another story about terrorism here. I have a good friend who was a terrorist. He sat in an Israeli prison for many, many years for stabbing a soldier to death. And when I met him, and when I heard, I wasn't right away that he told me what happened, but he was sentenced for life in prison, but then he was released in one of the prisoner exchanges in 1985. And the story that he described reminded me of my own military experience, and I talk about that again also in the book about being in the military. And I remember being as a young soldier being sent to some outpost somewhere to guard it. Now, I don't know what I'm guarding. I don't know why I'm guarding it. I don't know why the hell I'm there. But here I am, a young soldier, sometimes, usually 2 or sometimes 3. And you have a communication device, a gun, and some water, and you're told, just don't fall asleep. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. And you're clueless. At least I was. I don't know, maybe other people are not as clueless. And so this friend of mine, Jamal, went up with several others, and they found 2 soldiers in a situation like that, and they stabbed them to death. So who's the terrorist? Between he and I, who's the terrorist? And if you look, and I just happen to look at the United Nations, it's very clear about the rights of people who are oppressed to resist, and the rights of people to take up arms against oppressive racist regimes. I was the one that was working for the oppressive regime. He was the one that was resisting legally. And if we want to talk about terrorism in a greater sense, I understand those of you guys here in the bookstore, you had an event with commemorating the attacks on Gaza, or actually while the Gaza attacks were taking place. And you want to talk about terrorism, and once again, I go back to this conversation I had with this very nice Jewish couple, and they said, you know, these Palestinians, we gave them back Gaza, and now they're shooting all these rockets. So we talked a little bit about the situation in Gaza. No water, no food, no medicine, nowhere to go, no future, and whether or not the expectation that there will never be any kind of armed resistance is really a realistic expectation. But let's take a look at the first day of the Israeli assault, the first day of those 3 weeks of the Israeli assault against Gaza that began December 27, 2008, at exactly 11:25 in the morning. Israel began with an 8-hour bombardment where 100 tons of bombs were dropped from the air. 100 tons of bombs were dropped in one 8-hour period. Now, a 1-ton bomb will destroy a city block. Gaza is densely populated, it's not very big. 8 hours, 100 tons of bombs. What are they doing with all these bombs? Who are they killing? There was really an expectation that these bombs were going to stop the Qassam rockets, that they had anything to do with the Qassam rockets. And this was the first day of a 3-week assault. You want to talk about terrorism? As Israelis, we have a right to talk about terrorism? And then after the air assault ended several days later, then the ground forces came in. And I don't know if you saw pictures, but there are pictures of the troops, the tanks and the troops waiting to enter Gaza. When you look at the number of tanks and you look at the number of troops, you'd think the Russian army was there. This was World War II or something. There is no army in Gaza. Palestinians have never had an army. They've never had a tank. They've never had a warplane. What were all these troops planning to do in Gaza, if not destroy and kill civilians, if not terrorize an entire population? That's what they were there for. So again, when people talk about Palestinian terrorism, you know, when you think about it, and the fact that the decision makers in Israel began the attack at 11:25 in the morning. In Gaza, and some of you may know this, they have 2 shifts of the school day. There's a morning shift and an afternoon shift, and that is exactly the time when the 2 shifts are on the streets, one going home, one going to school. So 800,000 children are in the streets. Exactly at that time, they began the attack. And people who like to justify what Israel does says, yes, but you know, they dropped leaflets and they warned them. They warned them that the attacks were coming. So they'd get away. Get away where to? Gaza is locked. They have nowhere to go. So now imagine the parent that sees the leaflets and reads it and knows this is coming. These air assaults, the phosphorus bombs, the smoke, the destruction, and there's nowhere to take the kids. There are no bomb shelters. They can't take a boat and leave Gaza. Israeli Navy's there. They can't go anywhere. The border into Egypt was closed. So the fact that they notified them, this is supposed to be some kind of a gesture of goodwill? This is supposed to somehow justify this or excuse it? But there's always this tendency to want to, to blame the victim. People say to me, don't you see that the Palestinians are at fault here? Well, of course they're at fault. The Palestinians are at fault because they exist. They're at fault because they resist. They're at fault because they don't get up in the morning and disappear. Of course they're at fault. The victim is always at fault. This is how we do these. This is how this works. And the biggest question I think that is raised on this issue is, how is it that young Israelis who are raised in a seemingly, Western democracy, a free society, put on this uniform and become monsters? How can an young Israeli get into a plane, an F-16, and drop bombs when they know there are children, 800,000 children in Gaza? How do they do this? How do you get young people to be able to be so brutal? Not to mention the soldiers, the ground forces, not to mention the soldiers that go into, I heard talking here about Bil'in earlier, go into Bil'in and arrest children at the 2 o'clock, in the middle of the night, take them out of their homes, beat them up. How do you raise people in a kind of a seemingly Western democracy and yet get them to do these horrific things? And that's really the reason my sister Nurit wrote the book about the education system. That was the big question she tried to answer, and she answers it very well, I think, describing the racism, the textbook racism that exists within the Israeli textbooks. Palestinians are described either as non-existent or as a threat. A problem that we have to get rid of, or there's just no mention of their existence at all. She shows some maps in Israeli geography books. You look at the map is the entire land of Israel. It's never the state of Israel. It's the land of Israel. And there's no mention of Palestinians. There are no Palestinian cities, there are no Palestinian towns, there are no Palestinian schools. There are no Palestinian people. If anything, it would show like a little gray area saying, well, we have no data about these areas. No data? The Israeli security services, they know every single movement that every single person makes in the West Bank and Gaza. No data. But this is, and what happened, really what Israel did very successfully is they managed to create 3 arms of government that deal with this and make it possible. You've got the education system, very dedicated, very well thought out, that educates children in a way that when they're 18 and they're given a gun, they can do this with a clear conscience. They've created a bureaucracy, an entire bureaucracy, that's dedicated to making life hell for Palestinians, demanding permits and then creating restrictions, and we're demanding more permits and creating more restrictions. Michael Sfard, who's an Israeli human rights lawyer, a great guy, he calls it, in an article, he calls it oceans of permits and mountains of restrictions. There's an entire bureaucracy dedicated just for that. And they do it with a clear conscience. Part of that bureaucracy, by the way, is the prison system. Israel holds thousands of Palestinians in Israeli prisons in violation of international law. And it's practically impossible for a family from Ramallah to go visit their loved ones in a prison in Israel because of these restrictions and laws and so on. So that's a big part of that. And lately, because of the hunger strikes and so on, the prisoner issue has been in some of the headlines, not enough, but in some of the headlines. And then you've got the Israeli army. And in my opinion, the Israeli army is probably one of the best financed, best armed, best fed terrorist organizations in the world. And it's completely acceptable on everybody. This has completely become acceptable that this terrorist organization is funded by the U.S., is armed by the U.S., is fed by the U.S., and goes out and executes these horrific acts of terrorism. And then Israeli generals come here and they go to Columbia and they go to Harvard and they come for sabbatical here and they teach over there. Are we out of our minds? Seriously, are we out of our minds? Talk about having blood on your hands. So this is how Israel does it. It's got these 3 arms and it does it very, very well. And it runs this country. People talk about apartheid. Is it an apartheid? Is it not an apartheid? I don't know that how we describe it precisely, what word we use, is important. But what's clear is this: Israel has created 3 sets of laws to govern the people within its boundaries. We've got the laws that govern Israeli Jews, which are pretty much, kind of democratic laws. I mean, I can come and go. I can say what I want. My sister can write this book. She still teaches at the Hebrew University. And then you've got the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. They say second class, third class, fourth class citizens, categorize it how you will. But there are laws, clear laws in the law books that discriminate against them specifically, and then there's an entire culture, like I said, of discrimination against them. Just an example, I was talking to a friend who's a bank manager. A young Palestinian couple who are Israeli citizens cannot get a mortgage. Why? They can't. It's these kinds of things. And then you've got the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza who have absolutely no rights. There are no laws that protect them. They're still governed by the Israeli government, but under completely different sets of laws. And one of the stories I talk about in the book, I was at a protest in the West Bank and I was arrested. And what happens when they arrest an Israeli is they take you, the army puts you under arrest, takes you, and has to give you to the civilian police. And so they took me from the West Bank to the settlement where the police station was, and the police demanded that the officer who placed me under arrest come and fill out a statement. He didn't feel like coming, and these two soldiers were stuck with me, and they couldn't figure out why the police didn't want to take me. And it went on and on for hours. I was there almost the entire day as these two, it was unbelievable. The police and the army are arguing, yelling at each other on the phone, sending faxes. Finally, the station chief came out to try to explain to the soldiers what the problem was. And this was the problem. He said, he's an Israeli, he has rights. He's not a Palestinian that I can just beat up and throw in jail. That was the problem. And this demonstrates the different laws. If I was a Palestinian doing the exact same thing in the exact same place, an entirely different set of laws would have applied. So you want to call this apartheid, we can call it apartheid. When different sets, parts of the population are governed by different laws, that's typically apartheid. And I think it's time that we come to terms with the fact that when we talk about one state, it's no longer an option out of several. It is a reality. There is one racist apartheid state, and that is the state of Israel. And for the last 45 years, successive Israeli governments have done everything they could, everything in their power, so that the conquest of 1967 would be irreversible. This was done by design. Yet somehow people talk about Israel as this peace-loving country that has to deal with all these terrible Arabs and all these terrorists. The best Israel was ever willing to do, was to give the Palestinians some sort of an autonomy on areas that Israel was decide if the Palestinians behaved a very certain way that Israel agreed with. But they excluded the Jordan River Valley, which is about a third of the West Bank. They exclude the expanded boundaries of Jerusalem, which is a good another 10-15% of the West Bank. And it excludes the major settlement blocks, which are another big chunk of the West Bank. So I call these the three no's. These are Israel's three no's. And these three no's mean that there will never be a Palestinian state. And they know this. So all the talk that people still bring up about two states, about a Palestinian state, it's either an illusion or it's a lie. Because the reality is that Israel created one state and wants to get the Arabs out. Now the question, as people of conscience, as people who believe in peace, where do we put our efforts? Do we still put our efforts on this notion, on this myth that somehow the land of Israel, the land of Palestine can be partitioned into two states, which if you travel around, you'll see there is no area where you could partition. There's no one area that you can say, well, this is going to be the Palestinian country, and this is the state, and this will be the Israeli state. There's no such place because the communities are completely mixed. Or do we put our efforts into transforming this racist apartheid state led by, it's not a junta because it's not, they are elected, but basically by a junta of generals, into some kind of a democracy? What makes more sense? Where is it better for us to put our efforts and our dollars and our time and so on? And it's an absurd situation because people still talk about the two-state solution as though this is really the only viable solution, because Israel will never agree to a one state. Israel will never agree to give the Palestinians equal rights. Well, Israel doesn't agree to anything. Israel doesn't agree to two states either. Israel is not relevant. The state of Israel cannot be part of the solution because the state of Israel is the problem. Zionism is the problem. So it can't be part of the solution. The solution has to be dismantling Zionism in a peaceful way and allowing for equal rights so that Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace. That's the idea. And it may sound crazier now to you, even crazier now when I say that I fully believe that peace is possible under these conditions, but I'm fully convinced that this is possible. And maybe we can talk in the Q&A a little bit later how it's going to be possible, but I fully believe that this is not only possible, it's inevitable. But we have to see the reality the way it really is, and we have to really believe that there's a chance to see such a, to bring about such a transformation. Anyway, thank you all very much. I hope you get the book. Thank you.
Well, next we want to call up Helena Koban, who is the owner of Just World Books, who has published this great book, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her publishing house and her other activities. Thank you.
Well, it's really hard to follow Miko Peled because he is such an inspiring, wonderful speaker, such a clear thinker. And he really is somebody who, you know, in his writing and in his speaking, tells things the way he sees them because he has the experience of having lived them. I'm a Quaker, and we believe very strongly in lived experience. So that's one of the many reasons that I was really happy to publish The General Sun. Working with Miko on the book has been it's been a great experience. I think, you know, that the editors and Pamela, who helped with some of the original writing and gave Miko some good feedback, all of us found the experience really mind expanding. And I want to urge everybody here not just to buy one copy, but to buy lots of copies, because all of you have friends who need to be reading this. I think you can agree. I founded my publishing company 2 years ago after a long career as a writer and analyst myself, and I founded the company just as a kind of like, okay, I'm getting older. I have grandchildren. I want to think about the future. I want to think about supporting the work of younger people who have something important to say that is not getting heard in the current discourse. Miko Peled is an exemplary model for why I founded the publishing company. So in 2 years, we've published 11 books, Just World Books. Go to the website, justworldbooks.com. You'll see all the books that we've published already, most of which are about the Middle East, but I also have some books about our country's current wars in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area. We have 2 really exciting titles coming up. Very shortly, we have a book by Brant Rosen, Rabbi Brant Rosen, who is on the Rabbinical Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. And his book is going to be called Wrestling in the Daylight. You can actually purchase an advanced order right now if you go to the website. That's www.justworldbooks.com. And then in the fall, we have Leila El-Haddad and Maggie Schmidt, whose work was recently featured in Saudi Aramco World. We're publishing their cookbook, The Gaza Kitchen, which you will be absolutely delighted with. So anyway, like I say, buy lots of copies of Miko's book because your friends need to read it, and go to our website, www.justworldbooks.com. And thank you, Miko, so much for everything you do, and we need to get straight to the Q&A.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Helena and Miko. Oh, we're going to get to the Q&A in just a second. But we won't have this forum, this place, to have this kind of discussion if I don't ask for your support for Revolution Books. And if you've seen our website or gotten a flyer at front, you know that we're in a campaign now, and under the theme of the world needs revolution, Revolution Books needs you now, and to support and save Revolution Books by buying your books here. And just buy books and read them. Becoming a sustainer of the store. It is not possible to keep this store open, or any other store like this, of which there are none actually like this, without people sustaining the store every month and becoming what we call a friend of Revolution Books and giving a donation of $20 a month, for which you get a discount on your books. You get a deluxe coffee mug that says Revolution Books on it, but most of all, you get a bookstore where people can really explore through literature, through poetry, through theater, through political theory, through history and science, why the world is the way it is, and how it could be radically transformed. And there is no other place like that, like this. Revolution Books is unique One thing that was really striking is in Miko's talk, which I want to just, it leads into a bit of what's special about Revolution Books, is he began by saying, if you want balance, get your money back right now and leave. And at Revolution Books, our criteria is not balance. Our criteria is the truth, wherever it leads, and going to how the world actually is. And that's really very, very important, and it's very unique, because in the culture now, particularly for the last 30 years, there's been a lot of relativism. My narrative, your narrative, the Palestinian narrative, the Israeli narrative. Well, people have their stories, but there is one reality that actually happened, and I think that came through in Miko's talk. We'll get into that a bit more. And that's what we explore here, through lots of different ways. But at the heart of the store, and look, this is going to be controversial and maybe take some of you out of your comfort zones. At the heart of the store is a new understanding of communism, a new synthesis of communism that was developed by Bob Avakian. And I'm telling you about this because it really matters. If you want to understand the state of the world today, you have to understand what happened in the 20th century when there were revolutions that against this capitalist imperial system that accomplished amazing things, and they did. You want to talk about the Jewish people? The Soviet Union is one of only 2 states in the modern world that actually had equality as part of the law for Jewish people in Eastern Europe, Western Europe. Now, the story of the defeat of that revolution, its accomplishments, and its shortcomings is one that we're not going to get into fully tonight. But it is something that actually underlies the lack of revolutionary possibility in the world. And Bob Avakian has analyzed that and come up with a new synthesis of communism that greatly values the dissent, that sees the importance of the engagement of ideas as part of transforming all of the world and overcoming all the inequalities, which we can get into some discussion, that you can't actually do without uprooting the system itself. If we were to end the apartheid in Israel, we might end up with a situation like ending the apartheid in South Africa. And I would submit to you that the situation in the Bantustans of South Africa is even more horrific than it was in the 1980s. Why? Because people don't even have the hope of liberation now, and they don't understand what it is they're fighting. And this is the problem when you don't uproot the underlying social and economic relations that are involved. But these are the kind of things you find out at revolutions. Agree or disagree. But we really have to engage this. The world is a horror for the majority of humanity right now. And think about that. The trip that Miko has taken to confront the reality in the country he grew up in is a trip we all have to take, living in a place like this, New York City, at the top of the food chain in the world, and then contemplate where it is that the coltan in your cell phones come from, how it got made, where all this comes from. You contemplate that and the fate of the planet, you can start to see that there's a need to actually look at why is the world this way and how could it be radically transformed. But what I'm asking you for is not to agree with all of that right now. What I'm asking you for is to support the bookstore. And because this is a place where that gets engaged, and it doesn't happen anyplace else. So I don't know, have you passed the basket around? Okay, so there's a basket that's gone around. I hope you've contributed in that. Your funds, your cash, write a check. If you haven't done that yet, when you leave, you can see Connie or Judy at the back. We take credit cards. Next weekend, we're having a major sale, and I hope that your publishing firm, company, Just World Books, brings books to that, along with many other publishers who've donated books, and you should come and buy that. If you have a good used book collection, please donate it. That's part of saving the store. We just received, we're going to be picking up a collection of how many books?
30 cases.
30 cases of books from a doctor in New Jersey. Apparently they're all hardcover, so there'll be a lot of good books here. So look, with that, I want to encourage you to be involved in this. A woman in the audience tonight says, well, why are you facing this problem? Is it because of the rent? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's not just that. It's that many people in this room tonight are in Revolution Books for the first time. Maybe you've heard of it. Somebody said, oh, I've been to Revolution Books before on 18th Street or 19th Street. We've been here for 4 years. This is our fault. We've not let you know about the store. So you can help in that by spreading the word of this program tonight, of what you've learned about the store, and encourage your friends to come here and support the store. So with this, what I want to do is open up the Q&A. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that people have, and I guess what we'll do is, I don't know, if maybe I'll sit down there and help call on people, and yeah, and sure. That'd be a good way to go. So let me, there's a, oh, one thing, and I'm about to violate it. Well, wait for the microphone, because otherwise the questions won't be recorded on the videotape. So you had your hand up first, and then there's a hand here, and then we'll in back. Actually, here's an idea. Why don't we actually take 3 questions at once, and then Miko can address them.
Thank you for the great talk. What do you say, how do you respond to quote unquote liberal Zionists like Peter Beinart, who say criticize Israel, but in the same sentence you have to also praise Israel for the good institutions it has and so on? How do you respond to that?
Okay, then we have up here.
Okay, well, there's the general question of, you know, what do you think we can do now? And you're living in the U.S., so you must have some idea of what pro-Palestinian and different organizations are doing. And in particular, what do you think of the BDS, the boycott, the divestment, and sanctions movement?
And then in back on the left.
Hi, I entirely agree with everything you said, but I couldn't help wondering, when you mentioned the leafleting before the bombardment of Gaza, would not the leafleting have kept the 2 shifts of children off the street at that hour? And what about the extensive tunnel system with Egypt? Would that not have served as a bomb shelter?
Okay, there, yeah.
I wanted to know if you're reaching out to churches and synagogues in the country, because if they could hear this talk, if hundreds and thousands of people could hear it, also our Congress primarily, that would be a great thing. But that's not going to happen for a while. But are you reaching out at least to mainline churches and synagogues, because they have to hear what you have to say?
Okay, all right, liberal Zionism. Actually, if you go to my blog, mikopeled.com, there's an article called Liberal Zionism. And it talks about this, the liberal Zionists. And the thing is, you know, there are a lot of people who fall under that category. Here in the U.S., I think it's, I would venture to say here in the U.S., it's probably the majority of the mainstream Jewish community. And they all like to see, and I was just like that, they all like to believe that there is a possibility for this wonderful, democratic, developed, Western-style Jewish democracy, you know, in the Middle East. That there is a possibility for that. And they maintain that, belief, and they maintain this point of view, even as they see the bombs being dropped on Gaza. You know, I don't know if this is cognitive dissonance. I don't know what this is. There's a lack of desire to open their eyes and see that is no longer a possibility. There was a short window of opportunity where it may have been a possibility. Perhaps immediately after the 1967 war, there was a possibility. Perhaps 1 or 2 times before that. I mean, after that. But if you look at the development of the State of Israel, and this is one of the things I say in that article, when you look at Netanyahu, for example, who's the prime minister, when you look at Lieberman, who's the foreign minister, they are the direct and natural descendants of Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and all these other people, and Peres, and by the way, who was another one of those criminals. They are. This is a long line of people who have actually led Israel in this direction. Israel was always going to go in this direction. Zionism is the problem, and no solution that I can see will ever come out as long as people try to keep Zionism as part of the solution. Zionism is a zero-sum game on the land. The land belongs to the Jewish people. Period. It belongs to the Jewish people, and the state of Israel is there to protect it for them and keep it for them. There are all these problems, like, for example, Arabs. Well, we deal with it as best we can. We kicked as many as we could out. We kill as many as we can. We make life possible so that they leave. I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes about the Christian community 6 weeks ago or so. Excellent, by Bob Simon. So we got rid of the Christians almost entirely. Now we have the Muslims to deal with. We've separated the Druze from the other Muslims. Now maybe we'll separate a few others. That is the line. That is the development of the state of Israel. So what is happening today, dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on Gaza, is not, or I should say, is completely connected to the catastrophe of 1948. And I think this is what the liberal Zionists do not see or refuse to see. There's no difference. Ben Gurion and Golda and all these figures that Jews in America love to admire were monsters. They were monsters. They were dictators. They wanted nothing to do with peace, and every opportunity that they had, they made it absolutely clear that peace was not a strategic objective. Talking about peace is a good tactic. But peace is not part of our strategy. Our strategy is to be the biggest bully in the neighborhood so nobody messes with us, and so that we never have to make peace. That was the strategy. And that's the reply to liberal Zionism. They can praise Israel as much as they want. But they have to realize and open their eyes to the fact that they've actually created a monster. And I think eventually part of the reason I think this is not sustainable is because I think Jews in America will wake up and see that this is not the baby they wanted, that this is not the beautiful thing that they think it is, and I think that's going to be part of the process. What can pro-Palestinians people? Well, there's a lot that you can do. BDS is a big part of it. I'm a big supporter of BDS, absolutely. And I would say beyond that, people say, well, especially in the when it comes to boycotting goods, should they only be goods from the West Bank or in settlements? There's no difference between the settlements and the rest of Israel. The BDS should be applied to anything that has to do with Israel as an official, That BDS is an excellent tool, I think, and I know some of the people that run, the BDS movement internationally, and I think they're excellent people. And I think definitely the BDS is a good thing. And I know a lot of Israelis, a lot of Jewish friends who are active with BDS, and they will go around putting these little stickers, little labels on products to say, "Do not buy this. This is made in Israel." There's a little story that I mentioned in the book. One of the the trip to the West Bank to a protest in Abi Saleh, and we get caught. We were late, so we were stopped at there's already a checkpoint, and they didn't let us into the village, and this whole discussion ensued between me and the soldiers, me and a Palestinian friend and the soldiers. And one of the things I said to the soldiers is, why in the hell are you here? What business have you here? The people of Abi Saleh don't want you. We're here to visit and participate in this protest, which is their right. Why are you here? And they said, well, this is no different from Tel Aviv. This is no different from any other part of Israel. Jewish people live here, and we're here to protect them. Israel created this reality that there's no differentiating between the settlements and the rest of Israel. So if we're talking about BDS, about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, absolutely, I think it's very important. I think it's important to support, things like this, obviously. I think it's important, when Helena said buy 2 books, a lot of people do that. A lot of my talks, people buy 2 and 3 books because they say, I'm going to give it to my Jewish friends, or I'm going to give it to my Christian friends, or I'm going to give it because there's a huge, huge, huge gap in what Americans know. I have a lady that works for me, works in my office, and she's a wonderful, sweet lady. She's a Republican, and she's very conservative. We get along very well, but she's absolutely ignorant. And she traveled the world, and she's well educated, but she is completely ignorant. There's a huge lack of knowledge of the world in America, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Particularly, even more when it comes to Israel. You know, Iran. Oh, that's another thing. Iran. What about the Iran threat? What threat? What threat? Remember the WMDs in Iraq? Did anybody not know? No, nobody heard. I mean, this was news in Israel. Israel's biggest billionaire. His ships were seen in Iran loading and unloading about 6 months ago. This was in the Haaretz. This is a smoke screen. It's a sham. But here in America, people talk about it like this is, you know, this is the truth. This is the reality. There's a threat from Iran. You know, there's a huge gap in what Americans need to need to know, and I think that's the thing to do. The thing is to help them get educated. Certainly, write to your congresspeople. You know, be active. If you go to Palestine, then, you know, if you have an opportunity to go to Palestine and support Palestinian, the popular resistance, do that. This is what you do. You know, this is part of the activism. And let me tell you, this is a tough uphill battle. Israel is a monster. It's a military monster. Like I said, I wasn't kidding when I said the best fed, best armed, best financed terrorist organization in the world. They're not going to roll over and die. This is going to be a tough battle. But these are all different things that are going to help out, and these are the kind of people that are going to make it happen. You know, but definitely, I think BDS is wonderful, and I support it 100%. The leaflets, I don't know if the leaflets made a difference or not. I kind of doubt it. And the tunnels are bombed. When there's bombs around, the tunnels are destroyed. Israel destroys these tunnels from the air all the time. So the tunnels are no. When people get killed in them all the time, when Israel decides to bomb the tunnels. Churches and synagogues. Well, you know what? Once they invite me, I'll go. Once they invite me, I'll be happy. I'll be happy to go. They, you know, I think one of the biggest problems. And I don't mean to harp on American Jews here too much, but I think one of the biggest problems that happened to mainstream Jewish community in America and in other countries too, is they became Zionists. And when they became Zionists, they lost their humanity and they lost their Jewishness. Why do you need to have an Israeli flag in every synagogue? Why do you need to have, you know, all these invitations for AIPAC events in the synagogue? You know, they bought into Zionism with this, again, liberal kind of a thinking that perhaps this is this wonderful thing that we always wanted, and we need the protection and all that kind of stuff to protect us against from the Greeks and the Romans and the pharaohs and everything. And they made a big mistake. And you know, they don't. I'm not at the top of their speakers list. Mm-hmm. But once they do invite me, I'll be in Helen. I'm sure we'll send the books, and it'll be fine. You know, we'll take care of it once they do.
Well, if there's, oh, no, let me ask you, and, okay, these, oh. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm basically just wondering, it sounds like you're in favor of a one-state solution, which I would imagine means Jews and Arabs living with the same state, full equality of the law. I guess I'm just wondering, how realistically do you see that developing from the current situation?
I guess it's a similar question, but can you dismantle Zionism and protect the people, the Jewish people, and if so, how?
And one thing it seems that you need to talk about when you talk about the situation in Israel and Palestine today is the role of the United States. They certainly, right. Certainly, the state of Israel could have never been created without the role of major imperialist powers to begin with. I mean, the Zionist elite at the beginning assiduously courted the British Empire, and that didn't totally pan out. And then they switched their allegiance to the U.S. Empire, and the result has been that the largest foreign policy project of the United States in the post-World War II period is the State of Israel. So these things are inextricably bound up. And so when I think about it, I think about, you mentioned the analogy to South Africa. But what happened in South Africa, of course, is that the United States moved to remove the Boers, but for the purpose of preventing a genuine revolutionary movement from occurring South Africa, where the result is that the color of the flag changed and the color of the person in the executive office changed, but the actual social relations within society actually became worse for the great majority of people. So when we discuss this question of dismantling Zionism and the Zionist state, it seems that it has to be connected to some degree with our opposition to imperialism and to the capitalist system itself. I don't see any other way out of that. Just sort of in conjunction with that, there's a book I recommend that people get here called Basics by Baba Bacon, and one of the little quotes that he has in that book is that the second worst thing that's happened to the Jewish people after the worst thing that happened to the Jewish people after the Holocaust is the creation of the State of Israel. And the distortion of this idea of never again, it should be understood as not never again to the Jews, but never again to anyone.
Hello, Mr. Peled. Thank you for coming. I just wanted to ask you if you're familiar with Shlomo Sand's book, The Invention of the Jewish People, and if you think that might be a useful tool in your efforts in trying to change the perceptions between people in Israel.
Yeah, Shlomo Sand has a good book. He also has a really good video of a lecture he gave here in New York. Watch it.
We have to repeat the name of the...
I'm sorry. Shlomo Sand, his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, it's a good book, and there's also a good video on YouTube of him speaking and talking about the book here in New York, and it's a very good video. I recommend. I enjoyed watching it a lot. Is that it? Shall we get? Shall I start answering?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What is realistic? I don't know what's realistic. The question about realistic, I don't know what's realistic. Did anybody think the fall of apartheid was realistic 2-3 years before it happened? Probably not. Not a lot of people. Did anybody think that Mubarak would be removed by a popular revolution? As realistic, that was probably realistic is probably the last word most people would have chosen. When you look at fascist dictatorships in South America, when you look at in other places, I don't know that realistic. I don't know what realistic really means. I know that we have a current situation. I know that we have several forces that are operating within that situation, and we need to pick whose side we're on and do the best that we can to achieve the means that we think are best for everybody.
It's not a question whether it's realistic or not. I'm wondering, how do we get from what it is now to a...
Okay, well, that's a different question. Okay, in that case, well, we do, like I said, we support the BDS, we support the Palestinians, we make sure that people know what is happening. Anytime there's a protest here, in front of the consulate, the Israeli consulate, you go to support the Palestinians. Make sure that people know what you know and help this thing along. And again, be proactive about BDS, be proactive about rights for Palestinians and so on. That's how you get from here to there. Go there whenever you can, if you can, and participate in the Palestinian uprising that has been going on for a very long time. It's a nonviolent uprising. These are the tools that we have when we talk about a nonviolent resistance. And whether or not it's realistic, we'll know once it happens and how long it happens. These things, I don't think there's any way to say exactly when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen. I think it's inevitable that it will happen. I think it's very realistic, although again, what exactly realistic means is a question. And I think it's all about people like the people here in this room today to act and do things to achieve this goal. And that's how you do it. And you know what? And the thing is, I heard people talk about BDS saying, well, it's marginal, it doesn't really have an influence. You should see it from the Israeli perspective. You have no idea how much Israelis want to be liked. Just the fact that there's a movement out there. There's a movement out there. The Israeli symphony gets boycotted somewhat by the BBC. It's not aired. They gave the concert, but it wasn't aired by the BBC. This was the first in I don't know how many decades. That Israeli products, we used to be proud of, made in Israel, made in Israel. Made in Israel now is a curse. You know how insulting that is? Palestine Awareness Week. 5-6 years ago, there were a handful of universities and colleges that held a Palestine Awareness Week, or some call it Apartheid Week, Israeli Apartheid Week. They call it different names, but the same thing. This year, I think there are over 120 colleges that held this. And they bring speakers. I know I spoke at 3 or 4. all the major people, all the major activists speak in these events. They're wonderful events. Some of the universities put together just a major display on campus, and the word is getting out to a lot of other people who perhaps are indifferent or just didn't know. And that's huge. So when the local college does their Israeli Apartheid Week, it's usually around April, then go and support it. Go and listen to the speakers. So there's definitely a move in the right direction, and there's definitely a lot more people that participate and are learning about this from the right sources. Well, dismantling Zionism and protecting Jews. I don't know that Jews need protection. In Christian Europe, killing Jews was part of the culture for many, many years. It was part of what people did for entertainment, practically. Killing Jews was part of what Christians in Europe did. That's over. That's not happening again. Do Jews still need protection? And I don't know, again, that the state of Israel is the best place to protect Jews. I think in terms of Zionism, what Zionism did to Jewish culture after Hitler, it's probably the worst thing that happened to Jewish culture. When you look at European Jewish culture, from a Zionist perspective, it was something that had to be eradicated, and it was eradicated. And when you look at Arab Jewish culture, when the Arab Jews came to Israel, their culture was eradicated because they were Arabs, so we had to cleanse them before we accepted them into society. So today you have Orthodox Arab Jews, observant, who wear the same clothing that my grandfather's parents wore in Eastern Europe, instead of the clothing that their grandparents wore in Iraq or Egypt or wherever the case may be. So Zionism, I don't think served Jews well at all, and certainly the state of Israel is created a lot of problems for Jews. So I don't think that, and again, I don't. Another question that is kind of related to this is, don't Jews deserve? This is another thing that this sweet Jewish couple said. But can't Jews just have their own little place? I mean, can't we have our own little place? Well, you know what? Maybe we can have our own little place, but not over there, because half the population is not Jewish. Maybe a Jewish state is a good thing, and maybe Jews deserve a Jewish state, and the best to them. But in that particular place, half the population is not Jewish. How do you maintain a Jewish state when half the population are not Jewish? And you want a democracy. Jews don't want to believe that their state is not a democracy. Anyway, so I think that's an important point. The role of the U.S. Well, of course, one can go on and on and on about the role of the U.S. You're absolutely right. It's critical. I remember, my dad, before he passed away in '95. He used to come here to the U.S. as a retired Israeli general and tell Jewish audiences, because in those days the Jewish synagogues were still inviting him, and he would say the best thing you can do for Israel is ask the U.S. government to stop sending money and stop sending weapons. He said a country that buys weapons does not want peace. So the best thing you can do for the state of Israel is stop sending money and stop sending weapons. That's what he would say. And because the role of the U.S. is to send money, and then a lot of that money comes back here, and there's the whole arms industry, which makes a lot of money, and of course Israel is kind of a lab, really, to a lot of these things. And you're also right about the South Africa example. I mean, I don't think anybody doubts that what's going on in South Africa now is a tragedy. I think the reality in Israel-Palestine is slightly different because when you look at Israeli and Palestinian societies, there are a lot more parallels, or a lot more similarities. Economically, the disparity is not, well, there is disparity, but it's not that great. Both societies have a large middle class that's highly educated and ready to go to work tomorrow. You don't have to start teaching them, skills. You have engineers and doctors and teachers, and I mean, they're already there. Gaza has, I think, more doctors than probably any other place that size in the world. Both societies have a large, corrupt, well, not a bit large, but a very dominant, corrupt layer on top of politicians and rich people who are corrupt, who they hate and they want to get rid of. Both societies have kind of a fringe, although right now it's not that fringe. Right now it's rather big, but relatively speaking, it's a fringe religious fanatic group. And of course, I think on the Israeli side, they're far bigger, far more dangerous than on the Palestinian side. People talk about Hamas. I think the settlers and the people, the Jews in Hebron, are far more dangerous than Hamas. But they both have those, and they want to get rid of them. And the best way for Israeli and Palestinian societies to get rid of those two is to work together. So what Israelis and Palestinians when they do have the opportunity to live as equals, they do have the opportunity to send their kids to the same schools and get jobs and live like normal people, they'll be far more interested in, in providing for their kids than, fighting each other. But they will be concerned about getting rid of the corrupt politicians, and they will both be concerned about getting rid of the small fanatic religious groups, which I think will diminish anyway once the two sides work together, because the conflict fuels the fanaticism. So I think the prognosis for Israel Palestine is much better than, say, when you look at South Africa and what happened in South Africa. It was a lot easier for this disaster to take place in South Africa. But definitely the role in America. But I think the other thing to realize in America is that what happened in Egypt. Forget for a moment the fact that the Israeli Foreign Office and the Israeli Prime Minister were begging the State Department to support Mubarak to the last minute, but they saw that the winds were going in a certain direction, and then they went against Mubarak. I don't think the U.S. will ever step in and actually be an honest broker and bring about a resolution. But I think once this thing takes some kind of momentum, then the American president will say, "Oh yes, we need to do this as well." So there'll be kind of a follow, and then of course it all depends on how things shape up on the ground and exactly what kind of agreements are made and how this is resolved. People often ask me, "Yes, but how do we do this? And what kind of flag? And what's the national anthem going to be? And who's going to get what? What are you going to call it?" I'm going, "Well, this is the next step. Once they get to the point where the two sides can sit as equals, which has never happened, by the way, the two sides can sit as real equals in order to figure out how they're going to move forward. They'll bring all the smartest people, hopefully, and they'll resolve this. And there'll be a lot of power struggles and all that, but hopefully they'll resolve it in a good way." But of course, we don't have all the answers right now. So I think the U.S. was going to follow once this thing takes place. I think that's it. That was the last thing.
There was a...
Yeah, Shlomo Sand, I think the book is good, and I think what he says is very interesting. And I think, like I said, his speech here in New York, it's on YouTube, is worth watching. He's kind of a funny guy. He's kind of, it's funny. His English is not that great, but he's very funny, and it's good. It's a good hear. And he brings up some very, very, very interesting points. People treat it like he's some kind of anti-Semite, anti-Israeli, anti-this. He's bringing about some very interesting historical data, which a lot of which is known, but kind of ignored. That perhaps the Jewish people that returned to their land are not exactly the descendants of the ones that were exiled, because perhaps there was never an exile historically, Well, perhaps there was never a pharaoh that really enslaved the Jews, and perhaps there was a lot of things in Jewish lore and Jewish mythology that perhaps didn't exactly happen the way we like to believe they happened. But it's definitely, I think, a good book, and I think it's worth, I like it. I think his points are well put.
Okay, there's 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yes, you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to ask you about how you would demilitarize Israel and Israelis. I mean, from listening to interviews with your sister and you and the creation of monsters and racism, and seeing in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency today's news how Americans are going, or people are just, I assume they're mainly Americans visiting Israel. The latest tourist activity is holding M16 rifles and the whole shooting thing, and kill terrorists, and films, and educating youth from 5 years on up on how to protect yourself from terrorists, right, and gun shooting. So it's so ingrained, it's so seeping into the conservative Jewish politics here, etc. It's hard to imagine, because for us, our reference in the U.S. a lot would be, the struggle on the part of African Americans around basic human rights. Even when you have a constitution, you don't have a constitution, so that might be a first agenda item. I just, the level of violence and degradation and the constant, we just had 40,000 people in the streets around stop and frisk against New York police here. Because people really analyze that as Israeli technology and know-how coming to the United States, right? Okay, so where does the optimism come? This is what I can't break through in terms of Israel. I can't see the demilitarization, the humanization, the embrace of your morality. Next.
Is your hand still up?
Me?
Yep.
My concern has to do with the lumping together of the State of Israel and the citizenry of Israel. In other words, do you think that all citizens of Israel are Zionists? And if not, how come we don't hear about that segment of the population that is not in agreement with the governmental policies?
I don't have a question. I just have a...
Okay, well...
I do not have a question. I just have a comment or an impression. You spoke about the imperialists, etc., and you focused about the role of the United States. I wish you could say something about what should Europe do, because we know that the complex of capability of the Europeans is still there, and they will never rise against Israel. Also, a little note, also when you said that the Orthodox, the Arab Jews, what we call them Toshavim or Megorahim, etc. Now, you said that they are dressed like the Lubavitch. Well, recently I also learned that the Moroccan Jews who have nothing to do with the Holocaust, who are the Berbers natives of North Africa, or they are Arabs. I'm not stressing here the theory of the Professor Paul Wexler. I learned recently that Moroccan Jews now in Israel requested and obtained compensation from Germany. Isn't that laughable, ironic?
It is laughable if it's true, yes. I've never heard of it, but if it's true, it is laughable.
I raised my hand.
Yeah.
At first, when you said, who are those who are not going to, who do not believe in, I do not believe in one state, then it will not happen. I used to think like you when I was your age. I'm almost 80.
Where are you from?
I'm an American citizen, but originally from Morocco. And my name is Bahlouli. It is worn by Jews and Muslims. Bahlouli, it's the name of a Berber tribe which was Jewish before it became Muslim. It's not black and white.
Well, thank you for your comment. It's very interesting. Okay, shall I start? How do you demilitarize Israel? Well, I don't know that I have a really good answer to that, but I do know for a fact that Nazi Germany was demilitarized eventually. Now I hope that Israel doesn't have to go through what Germany had to go through and be bombed to oblivion. But it is possible. Fascist regimes in other parts of the world were demilitarized, and so exactly how it happens, I don't know that I can tell you, but I can tell you that it does happen. And like I said, it's going to be a tough uphill battle. This is not some force that's going to roll over and say, okay, let's all be good. Let's all become liberal Zionists. Absolutely not. They're going to fight this. And the way I know they're going to fight this is because I see how they respond to the nonviolent resistance in Palestine, in the West Bank. And I described several of those instances that, experience I've had in the West Bank where you'll have 30, 50 peaceniks marching in, Bil'in or somewhere in Abu Salah, one of these places. or the last place I was there for. When was I there? Recently, there was a big thing in Jerusalem. I can't even remember what it was. The most peaceful group of people I've ever seen in my life. There were more than 30 or 50 like normal. This was a bigger event. I can't for some reason remember the date. But there were several hundreds of Palestinians in Jerusalem preparing for a march. And boy, the violence of the Israeli forces, just the way they ram in with those horses, and the thing is, people don't like that the Israelis are compared to Nazis, but look at the way these guys are dressed. I mean, look at these stormtroopers in their black uniform and the guns and everything, and the way they ram into the crowd. And this is the most peaceful of the ones that I've seen. Certainly, one of the most peaceful. And they go in full force, because they know the only way that they can win is by force. In fact, all the greatest minds of the Israeli army met about 6 months or a year ago to discuss this. How do they combat the nonviolent resistance? And this was in ours. This was in all these Israeli newspapers. And they came out after hours and hours of debate, and their conclusion was they can't. They have no means. There's nothing they can do against it. So what do? More power, more firepower, more soldiers, more firepower, more violence. Then they go at night after the Israelis and everybody else leaves. They go 2 o'clock in the morning and they arrest the kids and and all that. But yeah, it's going to be a tough uphill battle. But I think history has shown that demilitarizing states like that is possible, or far greater threats than that. Citizens of the Israeli government, I don't know if you know this, but right now Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, has, I think, the largest coalition in the history of the state of Israel. In other words, there are more people there is no opposition in the Israeli parliament, in the Israeli Knesset. Almost out of 120, I think he's got 97 members of Knesset, members of parliament that are part of his coalition. I think Time magazine came out with him on the cover saying King of Israel or something, King Bibi. There is no opposition. I mean, I shouldn't say no. There's a small group of very dedicated activists. Many of them are anarchists, God bless them. And they go to every protest. And they get beat up and they get arrested, and they probably inhaled more tear gas than anybody should. And it's a small group, and then when you have like a bigger gathering, a bigger event, then maybe that expands a little bit, maybe several hundred, maybe 1,000. But that's the extent of the dissent in Israel to what the Israeli government does. And so it's a very sad state of affair in terms of opposition. A lot of it has to do with the education system, a lot of it has to do with the segregation, a lot of it has to do with the fear. I mean, as an Israeli, when you cross into the West Bank in any of the major checkpoints, and I have a picture of that in the book, there's a huge sign in Hebrew, and it's only in Hebrew, which is interesting. And the sign says this: this road will lead you to Palestinian-controlled areas. Entry for Israelis, entry into Palestinian-controlled areas is life-threatening and is a felony. Big sign in red and white, and I see it every time I cross back and forth. Now, if you're a normal person, unlike myself and unlike most activists, you look at that thing and you go, I'm not going past this. Now they added another sign on the way to Bil'in and some of the villages that have the most regular protests, weekend protests. There's a road. It's called the Apartheid Road. It's Route 433, I think it's called. And there's a big checkpoint there. And just before the checkpoint, they put another sign that says the commanding officer, the Israeli military commanding officer, prohibits Israelis and Israeli vehicles from proceeding to the villages, the Arab villages in the area. Now all of this is in Hebrew, so it's for Israelis, obviously, and that's very scary. So when you see that, you go, well, you know what? It's probably very dangerous. So maybe all these things we do to the Palestinians are somewhat justified. It's very easy to justify it when you're afraid. So there's really not much dissent or opposition in Israel, which is very, very sad. What was called the peace camp is gone. These were the last remnants of liberal Zionism, and they all went by the wayside because liberal Zionism is a myth. And then Europe, you know, there was a great story in Idiot, in the Israeli paper Idiot, the weekend paper of last week, about the nuclear submarines that Germany sells Israel now. And Europe makes a lot of money selling arms to Israel and maintaining the conflict. The French, the Germans, the English, they make a lot of money selling arms to Israel. So they are just as complicit as the U.S. I agree with you completely on that. And again, that's another part of the process. That's another part of the resistance that has to take place to get them to see that they need to stop that as well. And you're right that the guilt of the Holocaust and all that is a big part of that, and how they overcome that is another big question. It's probably a bigger question than I can answer right now.
Why should I pay for it?
Huh?
Why should I pay for it?
Absolutely
because
right.
I speak Arabic. I'm not even Arab.
True.
You know, I just want to. Well, one thing you mentioned, Beline, I think that I want to recommend that people, if it's still playing, see Five Broken Cameras. It will give you a very vivid picture of the nature of the IDF and the situation in terms of the lived experience. I did want to just speak a little bit to the question of what can you do about this. One thing I think people can do is really take on the main, if you will, ideological prop of Israel, particularly in the U.S., which is actually in one way gotten at by that quote from Avakian on the after the Holocaust, the worst thing to happen to the Jewish people is the state of Israel. This is a holy of all holies. That I thought it was very telling that you brought up how every synagogue has the flag of Israel in it. This is, you know, I mean, I'm an atheist in this store. We propagate atheism. But if you were Jewish, and I was once, this is unbelievable. And you actually have to think about that. And you actually took a people who had actually had a history of not only oppression, which is constantly invoked, but also a history of resistance, a history of people who were in the forefront of movements of resistance and for social justice. And this was turned around in just a few generations. That's where you do actually have to ask the question of why and in whose interest and how that all happened. And so I do think one thing that people need to do is go on the offensive on this. Put this in people's face. Make them confront this. And then never again, you know, the question that two people spoke to her, never again for whom? For everybody or just for my people? And that is a very big problem right now in the world. Because this is another impact of the defeat of revolution in the world, where there was a time when internationalism, what people were thinking in the world. People were thinking, you know, listen to the song The Internationale. Think about the kind of spirit that existed in the 1960s. Even for that matter, look at pictures of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 60s. They look like liberation fighters everywhere else. They were largely secular revolutionaries. But the defeat of these revolutions has meant that particularly in the Mideast, the resistance movements have turned into and found their political legitimacy in religious fundamentalism, which is actually true all around the world and is something we need to combat. So I do think people have to take that. And the second thing is see the connections. In other words, Israel is an occupying state. I think Miko has brought up very well that it's not just occupying the West Bank and Gaza, but it's occupying all of Palestine. But it's not the only occupation. And living here in America, my God, we're occupying still, just by the way, Iraq, Afghanistan, and as somebody pointed out back there, we're occupying East New York and the South Bronx and every place that has a majority Black and Latino youth population, where people are subjected to, 800,000 stop and frisks per year in New York City, which is just the beginning of a pipeline into a prison system that has over, 2.5 million people in prison at any time, and over 10 million people directly connected with that, and delegitimizing an entire section of people, let alone that here in America we're also an occupied country. I mean, whose country was this? I just think if making the connections is part of what you can do, because I feel if you only get, it's part of why we exist here at Revolution Books, if you only look at the one country and you get all caught up in the dynamics of it, it can seem, whoa, how do we get out of this? And you start getting way inside it and not looking at the larger picture. And just on this question of how is it possible? Well, actually, it's interesting. In the right as that June so-called Green Revolution in Iran, a couple summers ago, 2 years ago in June, a bourgeois commentator made the point that before a revolution, it always seems to be impossible, but after a revolution, it seems like it was inevitable. So you need to look much deeper at what are the underlying problems and contradictions, which I think Miko has brought quite a few of them out in terms of the formation of the State of Israel and what it's all about. But then you have to work for that. And so I would invite all of you to, when you pick up a copy of The General's Son, A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, or two or three, or a half dozen, and while you're also sustaining the store, that for $1 we are selling a reprint of the lead article in this issue of Revolution, which has been sold out, which is called The Case of Israel, Bastion of Enlightenment or Enforcer for Imperialism. Because I think this is very important for people to look at, both in terms of stuff that Clark brought out, the origins of the state, the shift in 1967, what the U.S. has done, and including this question of Iran and what the U.S. has at stake in Iran right now. And so, we can go on about this. I think maybe this would be a good time. If you want to have a last word, we can, but I want to encourage people to come talk to Miko, buy the book, he will sign them, and then stick around and talk informally for the next half hour, as long as you want to stay. So thank you for coming. Would you like to say?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.